Hi guys, I hope everyone's doing well today. Second video of the day. Today I'm going to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas's book, the Summa Theologica. It means the sum of theology, or a summary of theology. You see where we get these words from. It is, and I'm only going to be talking about one small part of this book. It's most often these days is published in about 5 volumes, and I looked it up the other day, and it's about 3,000 plus pages, so it's very big. I taught sections of it many times when I was a professor, but the section that I'm going to be looking at today, I didn't teach, at least not directly, when I was offering a course on Aquinas. So it's a section that's, I think, not often paid very much attention to. And the way that he breaks up this work, as I said, it's usually in 5 sections. And the confusing part is that the second section is divided up into 2 sections. And so there's a first part, 2 second parts, a third part, and then what they call a supplement to the third part. And there's a supplement to the third part because Aquinas died before he finished writing this book. So the supplement actually comes from a work he wrote earlier, his commentary on, I think it was his commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences, if I'm not mistaken. So this earlier work was chucked in at the end, and it deals with the sacraments, or like 4 of the sacraments, and then the resurrection of the dead. So it was his best work, his greatest work, but not his only work. He also wrote a work called the Summa Contra Gentiles, which is another summa of theology, another summary of theology, but with more of an apologetical or argumentative tone, I suppose, disputative tone. The way that the Summa is broken up into questions, so different topics, and then these topics all these questions have sub-questions called articles. I can't remember how many articles there are in total. There's hundreds, and so basically the way that the Summa Theologica is developed is that basically it goes from God, looking at God, and then it goes to creation and looking at, basically most of the time is spent on that part of creation, man, and then the man part, after the man part is basically ends with the resurrection. Okay, so basically we go from creation to resurrection. Okay, creation to the end of the world kind of thing. So they call it sort of a Platonic sort of cycle of treatment. So the second part is divided up into 2 parts, as I said, and these 2 parts are devoted to people. And the first part of the second part, which is called the Prima Secundae, is devoted to basically examining man's what the human being is, and then the second part of the second part, so the Secunda Secundae, is devoted to virtues and vices. So it talks about the most important virtues: faith, hope, and charity, and also prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. So the first 3 are called the theological virtues, and the next 4 are called the cardinal virtues. The cardinal virtues are from Plato. Anyway, and then at the very end of the second part is called acts which pertain to certain men. Okay, so the Prima Secundae and the Secunda Secundae are devoted mainly to what's true about human beings in general. So this would be equivalent to when Aristotle talks about Aristotle's ethics, right? Okay, the subject matter that Aristotle deals with in the ethics are mainly what Thomas Aquinas deals with in the second part. And then at the very end, of course, it's all with a Christian spin, obviously. So at the very end of the second parts, these acts which pertain to certain men would not have been things that that Aristotle would have looked at. So it talks about saints, talks about the people who wrote the Bible, things like that, like the exceptional people, the non-normal people. So what differentiates the normal people from the non-normal people is basically the difference between nature and grace. So everything's given by God, of course. So this thing is a cycle of creation, right? So man is created by God, and everything in man is created by God. But the special parts are only really, we can only really talk about them because it's basically God's action without man. Okay, so the acts which pertain to certain men are basically, we're talking about the work of grace. Okay, I don't know how long I should talk about grace. Grace is a basic Christian conception, and basically it means God's doing independently of anybody else's doing. So you could talk about different, there are different kinds of grace, which I'm not going to get into, but when you look at things on the grace side, you're looking at things on what God's doing usually without created medium, right? Creation is a grace, of course, but it's the kind of grace that's called nature. Okay, everything's a gift because God is pure gift, but this is a more direct sense of his gift or his action, not the indirect sense. So when we're talking about acts which pertain to certain men, we're much more focused on God's side of things. So not to say that the other virtues, like most of the second part talks about the virtues, and virtues really are only possible and fully present through God's gift. Okay, but we're not going to split hairs on that right now. So after he talks about these main virtues, which are relevant to every human being has a relationship with faith, with hope, with love, with fortitude, patience, charity, fortitude, temperance, and all that stuff. But not every man has a relationship, for instance, with prophecy, or with the gift of tongues, or miracles. And so those things occupy the first half of this section called Acts which pertain to certain men. And the second part of this section deals with different kinds of life. So and we're talking about prayer life, which is kind of the main category of that a theologian or religious person has to be interested in. So next, Thomas Aquinas talks about the distinction between the active life and the contemplative life. So contemplation is the highest act of man, so the act of prayer, the act of thinking about God. But obviously not everyone is a contemplative, so contemplates God, at least their job. And anything else is called the active life. So even, from farmers to fishermen to professors and even to bishops and priests, these people are engaged in the active life. Yes, bishops and priests live the active life, not the contemplative life. The only people that are engaged in the contemplative life are monks. So the church really generally calls them religious. And many of the monks or religious you'll encounter today are not contemplatives. The only contemplatives, which Aquinas is talking about here, are people who devote their whole time to prayer and live in monasteries. They don't leave monasteries. Like today we have monks coming and going and different kinds of things like friars and different things like that. We have monks who teach and different stuff. Those aren't contemplatives. Contemplatives are people who stay in monasteries and their main job is to pray. And when Aquinas was thinking about that, he meant following the rule of Saint Benedict. So Saint Benedict's rule for monks. And Aquinas, for instance, was a mendicant friar. He was a Dominican. He was a teacher and a preacher. That meant he lived a mixed life. Half his time was supposed to be spent in contemplation, and half of it was supposed to be spent in the world. And teaching is in the world. Preaching is in the world. Begging for food for the poor is being in the world. Okay, it's not contemplation. So after that distinction, he talks about the states of life in more detail. Like he'll talk about religious life, talks about bishops and different things like that. When I was looking at this section, I was mainly interested. Well, I did talk about. I'm talking about my own research purposes. I was interested in, of course, man's interaction with the written word. Okay, that was my focus. And so when you're talking about the written word, Aquinas' idea of prophecy is important. His idea of what he calls rapture. Rapture would be like a mystical experience. And he talks about the gift of tongues, or the grace of tongues, because it's mentioned in the New Testament. He doesn't mean by the gift of tongues what, for instance, anyone involved in the charismatic movement today would mean by the gift of tongues. I know they're using the same word, but they don't understand it precisely the same way. When Aquinas used it, he means these people were actually speaking a real language, not some mumbling or whatever, which charismatics generally mean today, just some mumbling or something. And when you're talking about sort of the contemplative life, what is contemplation? What is the engagement between the contemplator and the idea of God, or the idea of a passage from Scripture or the Psalms or something? So what is that relationship? How do ideas and words, what is their relationship with human experience? And of course, I focused my own attention on prophecy. What does Aquinas understand by the prophet? So primarily we're talking about the writers of Scripture. So Isaiah, Moses, he said, Jeremiah, Paul, Luke, John, Amos, all these people. What's going on with them? And what's interesting, I found, and this is an important point, is that he doesn't see that kind of prophecy as different from any person who's engaged in a relationship with God. So prophets are always chosen by God, but there's nothing that's going on with the canonical prophets in the New Testament or the Old Testament that can't go on with a contemplative today. Okay, so it's not a different God who speaks to the monk today that spoke to Nehemiah or Ezra in the past. It's the same God, and the spiritual relationship is the same. I know Protestants probably wouldn't like that idea. They see the biblical prophets as the only prophets, whereas Aquinas doesn't look at things that way. He doesn't see a difference between, for instance, Jeremiah and Augustine, or Pseudo-Dionysius, or any of the great fathers of the church. He doesn't see a difference in kind. There might be a difference in degree, but not a difference in kind. Okay, wisdom is wisdom, and that's that. I know that's not how Protestants see it. So this is something important to bear in mind, and it's really quite crucial if you're going to understand Aquinas versus Luther or Calvin or whatever. So anyway, I think this section of Aquinas isn't the first section you should read of Aquinas, because you don't study someone's thought by looking at the special weird situations he talks about. you get to know somebody by understanding first their general principles. You know, what is creation? What is grace? What is virtue? What is vice? What is sin? What is free will? What is knowledge? All these things. And then you look at the special cases. And so this section is the special cases. Go ahead and read it if you like. It's neat, but you wouldn't really know how to contextualize it. And so I'm sorry, you're going to have to read the 2,000 pages plus that come before this special section. Anyway, it's a lot of fun to read. It's really interesting if you want to sort of begin to think about, you know, what actually happened with Isaiah or Jeremiah or whatever. What actually happened according to Thomas Aquinas. Anyway, thanks very much, guys. I'm sure I'll talk about different parts of Aquinas later eventually, but I thought that was something interesting to talk about anyway. Okay, have a great day, guys, and I'm pretty tired now, so I guess this is probably my last video for today. Take care, guys. Bye now.